Dust swirled across the yard as Maggie Ross stood on the rough wooden platform, towering above the crowd, yet feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The late afternoon sun painted the auction square in copper light, throwing long shadows over the faces gathered to watch. They stared at her the way people stare at something they don't understand, their whispers sharp enough to cut through skin. Rope burns circled her wrists, faint but raw, a reminder of the trip that had brought her here. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. A voice boomed behind her. "Gentlemen, take a good look." Clyde Hargrove strutted along the edge of the platform, a smile fixed like a mask. 7 feet of solid strength, perfect for clearing land or moving boulders. Built better than any man you'll find. His words drew laughter from the onlookers. "She's bigger than a draft horse," someone yelled from the back. "Who'd marry that thing?" another voice called. Each jeer landed like a slap. Maggie forced her chin higher, fighting the urge to shrink. She focused on a memory of home, carrying fallen logs with her father in the mountain air, where her size felt like a gift instead of a curse. Opening bids, $50. Hargrove shouted, "50 for the best worker you'll ever buy." The yard went quiet. Maggie looked at the faces below. Curiosity, disgust, and something worse, pity. A crack spread through her chest, deeper than any wound she'd known. 25. Hargrove dropped his price, sweat beading on his brow. Surely somebody needs strong hands. A rancher near the front shook his head. Too strange. She'd spook my horses and scare the kids. Maggie's stomach nodded. Then the sound of boots echoed across the planks, steady, deliberate steps that made the crowd turn as one. A man climbed the platform with quiet authority. He wasn't tall, not what she'd expected, but the way he carried himself shifted the air. Conversation died mid-sentence. Hats came off. Even Hargrove faltered. James Maddox. Everyone in the county knew the name. He owned more land than some towns, and stories about him were as wide as the plains. Some said he built ranches out of nothing. Others whispered about enemies who vanished after crossing him. "Mr. Maddox," Hargrove stammered, his showman's voice thinning. "An honor, sir. Interested in a bid." "How much?" James's voice cut through the heat like cool steel. "Well, we started at 50, but right now." I asked how much. 50, sir," Hargrove said, paling. James pulled a worn leather wallet from his coat, his movements measured. He glanced at Maggie, not the way the others had, not as if she were livestock or a joke. For a heartbeat, his gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. Something flickered there, something that didn't belong in a sale yard. Recognition. 100, he said, peeling off crisp bills. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Hargrove nearly dropped his gavel. That amount was more than most men earned in a year. "Sir, you might want to inspect." 100. James's tone hardened. Maggie barely heard the auctioneer stutter through the sale. Her eyes stayed on James, searching for what she'd seen in his face. It wasn't curiosity or contempt. It wasn't calculation about her strength. It was guilt. The deal closed in less than 3 minutes, but it stretched like an eternity. James signed papers with the calm of someone used to closing impossible bargains. Around them, the square stayed silent, as though the transaction had broken an invisible law. Hargrove cleared his throat. "She's yours, Mr. Maddox." But James wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was studying her, and the sorrow in his eyes made her knees feel weak. "Come down," he said quietly. It wasn't exactly a command, yet Maggie knew from the weight in his voice that it wasn't a request either. She climbed from the platform, her long legs making short work of the step. Up close, he barely reached her chest, but his presence filled the space between them. The people who'd gathered began drifting away, but Maggie could still feel their stares on her back, already shaping gossip that would travel faster than any horse. James glanced at her tattered dress. "Do you have anything else?" She shook her head. Everything she'd owned was gone, sold or lost on the road that had led to this place. He nodded, as if he'd expected that. "We'll take care of it." At the edge of the square, a black carriage waited. The driver, a thin man with restless eyes, sprang to open the door. James gestured for her to go first. Maggie hesitated, eyeing the narrow frame. "I don't think I'll fit." Her voice sounded rough. It was the first time she'd spoken since arriving. James studied the carriage, then her height, calm and thoughtful. "You're right." He turned to the driver. "Follow behind us. We'll walk to Ellen's shop." "Dress shop?" Maggie asked, startled. "Yes." He set off through the street, and she followed, unsure if what waited ahead was kindness or another kind of cage. The wooden sidewalks creaked beneath Maggie's steps as she followed James through town. Afternoon light spilled across weathered storefronts, catching on faces that leaned from doorways to watch. Children peeked from behind aprons, wide-eyed at the sight of a woman taller than most men. Their parents tugged them back inside, whispering things Maggie couldn't hear but felt all the same. James walked ahead, unhurried. He moved with the confidence of someone used to owning every inch of ground under his boots. Yet there was no arrogance in the way he glanced over his shoulder, checking that she was close enough that she didn't stumble on the warped boards. Maggie studied him, searching for clues. He wasn't what she'd imagined when she heard stories about James Maddox. No towering outlaw or flashy cattle baron. Just an ordinary-looking man with gray eyes that didn't seem to miss much. The weight he carried wasn't in his shoulders, but somewhere behind his gaze, as if a shadow lived there. They stopped outside a narrow shop painted pale green. A sign above the door read Whitmore's Fine Dresses in fading gold letters. James pushed the door open, and a bell chimed overhead. Inside smelled of soap, wool, and the faint sweetness of lavender. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, soft blues and creams catching the late light. At a table near the window sat Ellen Whitmore, a seamstress with kind hands and quick eyes. She looked up from her stitching, smiling automatically, until she saw Maggie ducking through the doorway. The smile faltered, replaced by an uneasiness she tried to hide. "Mr. Maddox," she said, dropping her needle. "What brings you here?" "She needs clothes," James answered. "Something sturdy, something decent." Ellen's gaze flicked toward Maggie, taking in a worn dress stretched tight across her frame. I'm not sure I have anything ready for someone." "Tall." James finished for her, gentle but firm. "Yes, sir," Ellen murmured, cheeks coloring. James stepped farther inside, scanning shelves with a look that suggested memory rather than curiosity. "You still have that roll of blue wool in the back." Ellen froze. "How would you know about that?" "It's been sitting there for years. A special order that was never claimed." James didn't answer. Maggie watched the exchange, uneasy at the way Ellen's face drained of color. "What order?" Maggie asked quietly. Ellen hesitated, twisting a scrap of fabric in her hands. "A woman came through 3 years back. Like you, tall, strong. Mr. Maddox brought her here for a dress." Maggie felt the room tilt. "Where is she now?" James's jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed to search for words. Then he let out a breath heavy with something darker than regret. "She's gone." The shop grew still. Ellen's eyes brimmed with a sorrow that said she already knew where the conversation was heading. James looked at the floor, then back at Maggie. Her name was Catherine. Catherine Rose. She didn't survive this town. Maggie sank onto a small wooden chair, the legs creaking under her weight. "What happened to her?" James leaned against the counter, fingers curling around the edge as though steadying himself. "I found her in a traveling show, locked in a cage while folks laughed and threw coins. They called her the Gentle Giant. I bought her freedom, brought her home, gave her a job and a room on my land. For a while she was happy. I thought I'd done right by her." His voice caught, almost too soft to hear. "Then I started bringing her into town, thinking people would see past her height if they got to know her. I was wrong. Fear runs deep here. They called meetings behind closed doors. Decided she didn't belong." Ellen wiped at her eyes, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. "One night, while I was away," James continued, "a group went to her cabin, told her she needed to leave. She refused, said she'd found a home at last." He paused, swallowing hard. "They burned it with her inside." The words fell heavy in the quiet room. Maggie gripped her knees until her knuckles whitened. She could almost smell the smoke, hear the rush of flames. "The sheriff called an accident," James said bitterly. Said a lamp tipped. But I knew better. Ellen set the fabric aside, her hands trembling. He made them pay, she whispered. Every man who stood by that fire lost something before the year was out. James didn't deny it. He met Maggie's eyes instead, and what she saw there wasn't just grief. It was a vow carved deep into his soul. I swore no one would hurt another woman like that again, he said. Maggie held his gaze, unsure if the promise comforted her or pinned her in place like another rope. Ellen's scissors snipped through the quiet, shaping pieces of the blue wool into a rough outline of a dress. Maggie sat near the window, hands folded tight in her lap, staring out at the street where late sunlight slid across the dust. James stayed near the doorway, watching the road as if danger might walk through at any moment. The silence between them wasn't empty. It felt like the room itself was listening. Maggie wanted to speak, but didn't know how to begin. The story of Catherine clung to the air like smoke, and her own future felt tangled inside it. "How long have you known about me?" she asked finally, her voice low. James turned his head, gray eyes meeting hers. "A while. You were looking for someone like her," Maggie said, realizing as she spoke. "Like Catherine." He hesitated, then nodded once. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again. When I heard there was a woman your height working for a freight outfit 2 counties over, I went." Maggie studied him carefully. "To save me, to keep you alive," he said. "But I won't lie. I also wanted to make things right. I didn't protect Catherine the way I should have." The words landed heavier than any chain. Maggie felt a pull of sympathy for his grief, but a voice inside her whispered caution. Protection, she knew, could turn into a cage. Ellen laid another piece of cloth on the counter, her fingers steadier now. "This will take 3 days at least," she said gently. James shook his head. "We don't have that long." Maggie frowned. "Why not?" He didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the glass, scanning the street beyond the reflection of his own face. "Word spreads fast in towns like this. By tomorrow, everyone will know I bought you. By the day after, they'll start asking why. And after that," his voice trailed off. Maggie felt a shiver despite the warmth in the room. She didn't need him to finish. She'd lived through whispers turning to stones, stares turning to hands ready to shove her aside. "So, what's your plan?" she asked. "I have a cabin in the mountains," James said. "Secluded. You be safe there." "Safe," she echoed, the word flat on her tongue. She imagined snow-dusted pines, the hush of wind over ridges, and the long shadow of loneliness. She pushed herself up from the chair, straightening to her full height. "You want to hide me. I want to protect you," he corrected, but his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "You think if you keep me out of sight, no one will come for me," Maggie said. "But you're not saving me. You're just putting me somewhere you don't have to watch me burn." James flinched, a muscle jumping along his jaw. "That's not what I meant," he said quietly. Ellen cleared her throat, uneasy. "Maybe I should close the shop for the day." "No," James said, turning to her, but keeping his eyes on Maggie. "She deserves to hear the truth." From inside his coat, he pulled a folded paper, yellowed and frayed at the corners. He held it out to Maggie. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was jagged, the message short. "We know you got another giant. She won't be safe anywhere. We're watching." Maggie felt her blood chill. "When did you get this?" 3 days after Catherine died," James said. "And the day before I came looking for you." She looked up sharply. "So you were planning this all along?" "I was planning to keep you alive," he replied, but there was no triumph in his voice, only weariness. Maggie set the note on the counter. Her hand shook, not just with fear, but with the understanding that she had been chosen, not only rescued. Whatever had brought James Maddox to her wasn't only about kindness. Before she could speak, a sound outside snapped the tension tight, boots scraping against the porch boards, several pairs moving together. Ellen stiffened, scissors clutched in her hand. James's posture sharpened as he glanced at the door. Low voices drifted in, rough with liquor and purpose. Maggie's pulse thudded in her ears. She didn't need to see faces to recognize the type. Men who drew courage from numbers and shadows. The doorknob rattled, and the shop door swung open so hard the bell above it tore loose, clattering to the floor. 5 men crowded in, bringing the smell of whiskey and dust. "Well, look what we've got here," said the stocky one in front, eyes narrowing as they fixed on Maggie. "Family reunion, isn't it?" The leader of the group stepped farther inside, boots grinding grit into the floorboards. His face was ruddy from drink, his whiskers the color of old iron. The way he looked at Maggie was colder than the autumn wind slipping through the open door. James shifted immediately, placing himself between her and the men. His voice stayed even, though Maggie saw the muscle flick in his jaw. "You're on private property, Henderson. Leave." Henderson's smile held no warmth. "Can't do that, Maddox. Town council met this afternoon. Folks are nervous about history repeating." Behind him, the others spread out, pretending to browse shelves, but really boxing Maggie in. Their hands twitched near belts and pockets. Ellen backed against the wall, blue cloth clutched to her chest like a shield. Maggie felt the weight of every stare, every inch of the room pressing in. She remembered Catherine's name, the cabin, the fire. Her fingers curled around the edge of the stool until the wood dug into her skin. "History," James said, his tone quiet but sharp. "You know what I mean," Henderson replied. "We let one of them settle here once. Ended in ashes." Maggie's heart pounded, but something inside her straightened. She stood, drawing herself to her full height. The top of her head nearly brushed the hanging lantern. "If you're talking about Catherine," she said, her voice clear, "say her name. Don't hide behind words." Henderson's smirk wavered. James's gaze flicked to her, unreadable but steady, as if lending her strength without speaking. "You think you're brave?" Henderson said, turning back to Maggie. "You don't know this place. Folks won't stand by and watch trouble grow again." Maggie took a slow step forward, the boards creaking under her boots. "If you plan to hurt me," she said, "do it right here in daylight. Don't wait for darkness like cowards." A flicker of doubt moved across Henderson's face. One of his companions shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the windows where a couple of townspeople had paused, drawn by the raised voices. "You don't scare me," Henderson said, but the bluster rang hollow. "You burned a woman alive," Maggie replied, her voice low and steady. "That wasn't strength. That was fear wearing a man's boots." Ellen's breath caught audibly. James stayed silent, his stance steady but coiled, ready to move if hands went for weapons. Maggie looked at each man in turn. "You think you're keeping your town safe, but all you're doing is teaching your children to hate what they don't understand." A hush settled, broken only by the faint clatter of Ellen setting her scissors down so carefully they barely made sound. Henderson glanced at his men for support. Two stared at the floor. One looked out the window, as if measuring escape routes. "You can't stay," Henderson muttered, but even he seemed unsure. "I'm not leaving," Maggie said simply. She felt her spine lengthen, her shoulders drop into a strength she hadn't known she still carried. "I didn't survive everything behind me just to crawl away from bullies." James's eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time since the auction, something like pride softened their steel. The room held its breath. Then the door pushed open again, letting in a square of fading light. Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped through, hat in hand, followed by 3 deputies. Behind them came faces Maggie didn't expect: Dr. Samuel Welsh, Mayor Franklin Cole, and half a dozen townsfolk, shopkeepers, ranch hands, 2 women holding small children close. Henderson stiffened. "Sheriff, we were just threatening a woman," Bradley finished, his voice flat. The doctor moved forward, removing his hat as if entering a church. "Miss Ross," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. I stood by when Catherine was cornered. I said nothing, and I've regretted it every day." Mayor Cole nodded, his lined face heavy with shame. "We all have." A murmur rose from the people gathered behind them. Not whispers this time, words spoken aloud, steady with remorse. Henderson's shoulders hunched as his backing crumbled. 2 of his followers drifted toward the door, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. "She's not natural," Henderson blurted. "She doesn't belong." Dr. Welsh's voice was firmer than Maggie expected. "She's a human being, and what we did to Catherine Rose was murder, plain and simple." Ellen finally moved from her corner, still holding the folded fabric, but no longer hiding behind it. "I should have helped Catherine," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't make that mistake again." The sheriff looked from Henderson to James, then to Maggie. "This stops tonight," he said. For the first time since stepping off that platform, Maggie felt air reach the bottom of her lungs. The shop didn't seem as small, and the faces surrounding her weren't all hostile. There were still shadows in the room, but they no longer felt bigger than the people standing against them. The room stayed still for a heartbeat after the sheriff spoke. Maggie felt the tremble in her hands ease a little. People were finally standing where it mattered. She wasn't alone anymore, but the night outside the windows reminded her how fast things could change. Henderson's face tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said, looking at Sheriff Bradley. "You think she'll fit in? She'll ruin this town the way the last one did." "She didn't ruin anything," Bradley said, calm but firm. "We ruined her life because we let fear decide what was right." Henderson's jaw worked. "You weren't there the whole time, Sheriff. You didn't hear what folks said about Catherine. She was trouble." Maggie stepped closer, her head almost brushing the rafters. "Catherine wasn't trouble. She was a woman who wanted a place to live without being hunted." The words came out steady. She surprised herself with how sure they sounded. For a second, even Henderson didn't seem to know what to say. James moved forward just enough to stand at her side. He didn't speak, but Maggie felt his presence like a wall. Not one that trapped her, a wall built to hold against a storm. Mayor Cole cleared his throat. "This town can't undo what we allowed before, but we can stop it happening again." He looked at Maggie. "If you choose to stay, you'll have our word." Henderson scoffed. "Words won't change who she is." "No," Maggie said, turning to him. "But they can change what you decide to be." She let the silence sit, heavy but calm. Bradley signaled to his deputies. "Take Mr. Henderson outside. We'll talk in my office about the threats made here." Two men stepped forward, guiding Henderson toward the door. He struggled for a second, then seemed to shrink, letting them lead him away. When the door shut behind them, the shop felt lighter. Ellen let out a breath she had been holding since the men arrived. She set the blue fabric on the counter and pressed a hand over her heart. "I thought we'd see another fire tonight," she whispered. "No one's burning anything," Bradley said. "Not while I wear this badge." The doctor put his hat back on and gave Maggie a small nod. "We can't change what happened to Catherine, but we can choose what happens to you." Maggie looked around the room. For the first time since she'd been hauled to the auction, the faces watching her weren't filled with scorn. Some looked sorry, some were cautious, but most held a quiet respect. It felt strange, almost fragile, like a glass that could still shatter. James finally spoke. "I thought the only way to keep you safe was to take you away from everything. I see now that hiding isn't living." Maggie met his eyes. The guilt she'd seen there before was still present, but there was something warmer beneath it. Hope, maybe, or a promise. "I don't want to disappear," she said. "I just want a chance to live like anyone else." "You deserve that," Ellen said softly. She picked up the fabric again, a hint of purpose steadying her hands. "Let me finish this dress. When it's done, I want you to wear it to the harvest dance next month. People need to see you as more than a story they whisper about." Maggie felt heat rush to her cheeks. She'd never worn anything special, never been invited to a dance. For a moment, the thought felt too big to touch. Then she nodded. "I'd like that." The sheriff tipped his hat. "We'll be keeping an eye on things. No one will lay a hand on you." He looked toward James. "And Maddox, don't try to carry this alone. Let people help." James gave a short nod, his face thoughtful. The townsfolk began to drift out into the cooling evening, speaking quietly to one another. Their words weren't angry or mocking. They were making plans for watch schedules, for how to set the record straight if new gossip started. When the last of them left, only Maggie, James, and Ellen remained. The shop smelled of wool and lamp oil. Outside, dusk settled over the street like a soft blanket. Maggie sat back down on the stool, the same one she'd clung to earlier. Her legs felt heavy, but not from fear this time. She realized how tired she was from carrying her own worth on her shoulders for so long. James leaned against the counter, watching her quietly. "You stood taller than anyone in this room tonight," he said, "and not just because of your height." Maggie gave a faint smile. Maybe I finally remembered who I am. Night had fallen by the time the last voices faded down street. The lamps inside the shop cast soft halos against the windows, throwing their reflections back at Maggie like fragile ghosts. She stayed seated on the stool, fingers tracing the worn grain of the wood. For the first time since morning, she let herself breathe without waiting for the next blow to come. Ellen gathered her tools in quiet motions, folding the blue wool with care before setting aside. She moved closer, her face gentle now instead of guarded. "You did well tonight," she said softly. "I don't think I could have stood as steady as you did." Maggie gave a small shrug. "I don't know how steady I felt." Her voice cracked just a little, betraying the weight still sitting in her chest. "I was scared." "Scared people don't usually speak the truth like that," Ellen replied. She rested a hand on Maggie's shoulder for a heartbeat, then stepped back, giving her space. James remained near the doorway, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat. He looked like a man who had stood through storms and didn't quite trust clear skies. "They'll talk for a while," he said, "but talk doesn't burn cabins. Not when a sheriff and half the town have already taken a stand." Maggie studied him in the lamplight. He seemed older than he had that afternoon, but also somehow lighter, as if some old weight had shifted just enough to let him breathe. "You've been carrying Catherine with you," she said quietly. James's eyes met hers, shadowed but open. "Every day." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "When I saw you on that platform, I thought I was getting a second chance. I didn't ask if that was what you wanted." "I wanted someone to see me," Maggie admitted. "But I don't want to live inside somebody else's guilt." He let out a low breath, almost a sigh. "Fair enough." Ellen turned up the flame on the lamp, warming the edges of the room. "You don't need to settle everything tonight," she said kindly. "Tomorrow, we start with a dress. Small steps, one at a time." Maggie smiled faintly. "I've never had anything made just for me." "Then it's about time," Ellen replied, her voice carrying quiet determination. The clock on the wall ticked past 9. Outside, the last light faded, leaving the shop wrapped in a calm Maggie hadn't felt in years. She rose slowly, stretching her long arms, as if shaking off dust that had settled over her life. James straightened from the counter. "I'll see you back to the carriage," he said. "You shouldn't walk alone tonight." Maggie hesitated. The thought of returning to the wagon that had brought her here filled her with a dull ache. "I don't want to leave town like I'm sneaking away," she said. "I'd rather stay somewhere close, where people can see I belong." James looked at her, weighing the choice. "There's a room above the inn," he said at last. "It's plain but clean. I can pay for a week, long enough for folks to get used to the idea you're not running." "That sounds better," Maggie said. Relief threaded through her voice, though part of her wondered if rest would even come. Ellen fetched a shawl from a peg and draped it over Maggie's shoulders. "It gets cold once the sun's down," she said. "Keep this until you've got something warmer." Maggie wrapped the soft fabric around herself, surprised by the simple kindness. She'd learned to expect rope, cuffs, and hard ground, not gifts given without a price. When they stepped outside, the night air smelled of pine and the faint sweetness of baking bread drifting from the boarding house kitchen. The town no longer felt like a threat crouched in the dark. It felt watchful, waiting to see what kind of woman she would be. James walked beside her, silent at first. Then he said, "You didn't just defend yourself in there. You gave everyone a chance to be better than they were." "I wasn't thinking about that," Maggie said honestly. "I just didn't want to let them take another piece of me." "That's enough," he said. "Sometimes that's all courage is." They reached the steps of the small inn. A warm light glowed through the curtains, and laughter floated faintly from the dining room. James held the door, and Maggie ducked under the frame. For once, the ceiling didn't feel like it was closing in. It felt like shelter. The innkeeper, a round man with kind eyes, handed over a key after a quiet word from James. "Room 3, he said. "Fresh sheets. Breakfast at dawn if you're up early." Maggie took the key, its weight solid in her palm. It was the first thing in a long time that felt like it belonged to her, not because someone handed it over, but because she'd earned the right to keep it. As she climbed the narrow stairs, she realized her hands had stopped shaking. The room upstairs was small but warm. A single lamp burned low on the nightstand, throwing a soft circle of light across the quilted bedspread. Maggie closed the door and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle over her. She had been moving since sunrise, pushed from one moment to the next, and now her body finally felt the weight of everything. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in Ellen's shawl. The wool smelled faintly of lavender and clean air, a comfort she hadn't expected. Her hands traced the stitching on the blanket as her mind went back over the day. The auctionyard, James's steady voice, the faces that had turned toward her in the dress shop. So much had shifted in only a few hours. A soft knock sounded at the door. Maggie hesitated, then opened it to find James standing there, hat in hand. His gray eyes looked tired but calm. "May I come in for a minute?" he asked. She stepped aside. He stayed near the doorway, careful not to crowd her. For a man who often filled a room without trying, he looked almost shy. "I wanted to make sure you're all right," he said. "It's been a long day." "I'm fine," Maggie answered, though her voice carried more weariness than strength. "Just trying to believe everything that happened." James nodded. "It's a lot." They stood in an easy silence for a while. The sounds from the dining room drifted up through the floorboards, clinking dishes, a burst of laughter, the soft hum of someone playing fiddle near the hearth. Life was still going on below them, steady as a river. "I meant what I said back there," James said at last. "I was wrong to think hiding you would fix things. I was thinking about my failure, not your future." Maggie studied his face, the lines drawn by years of work and loss. "You were trying to make up for Catherine," she said gently. His shoulders sank. "Yes, and I can't, but I can stop letting guilt steer every choice I make." "That's a good place to start," she replied. James gave a faint smile. "You've got more grit than anyone I've ever met." "I had to," she said, shrugging one shoulder. "When you grow up taller than most men, you learn early that you either bow your head or stand firm." He looked at her for a long moment. "I hope you'll stand here with us." "I want to," she said. "But standing isn't something I can do alone." "You won't have to," he promised. The lamp flickered as a breeze pushed at the window pane. James glanced at it, then back at her. "Tomorrow, I'll talk with the sheriff and the mayor. We'll set things in place so nobody tries to start trouble again. And Ellen will need to take your measurements for the dress." Maggie laughed softly, a sound that surprised her. "I'm not sure anyone's ever measured me for anything that wasn't a pair of shackles." "Then it's time we fix that," he said. The laughter faded into a quiet that felt less heavy than before. James set his hat back on, preparing to leave. "Get some rest," he said. "You've earned it." When the door closed behind him, Maggie sank back onto the bed. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of the town settling for the night. She thought about Catherine, about the way her life had ended and how close Maggie had come to sharing the same fate. But tonight had ended differently because people had chosen to do the hard thing, to stand up instead of turn away. Maggie rolled to her side and pulled the quilt around her shoulders. For the first time since she could remember, she felt a quiet seed of safety. Not the fragile kind built on secrecy, but something stronger, rooted in truth and shared courage. Sleep came slowly, but it was soft when it arrived. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, painting soft gold across the room. Maggie woke slowly, surprised by how deeply she had slept. For once, no bad dreams chased her out of rest. She sat up, stretching her long arms toward the ceiling, and felt a quiet strength humming inside her chest. Downstairs, the smell of fresh bread and coffee floated up the stairwell. She followed it to the dining room, where townsfolk were finishing breakfast. Conversations hushed for a moment as they looked at her, then softened into nods and smiles. No whispers, no cruel jokes, just people, curious but respectful. Ellen stood near the door, a folded bundle in her arms. She smiled, her eyes kind. "Thought you'd need this before we start sewing," she said, handing Maggie a sturdy blouse and skirt. "Something to get you through until the dress is ready." "Thank you," Maggie said, touched by the simple generosity. She slipped the clothes over her frame and felt, for the first time, that they actually belonged on her. James waited by the window, a mug in hand. The morning sun caught silver in his hair. "The sheriff stopped by," he told her. "Henderson's cooling his heels in a cell." The mayor's gathering folks this afternoon to make it clear that what happened years ago won't be repeated. Maggie nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing. I'm glad, but I know it doesn't end with one speech. No, James said, meeting her eyes. But it starts there, and with people like you. After breakfast, they walked together down the quiet street. Children played near the well, their laughter echoing across the dusty boards. One small boy waved shyly at Maggie. She hesitated, then waved back, earning a grin so wide it made her chest ache in a good way. They stopped in front of the dress shop. Ellen had already set a table outside to catch the light, scissors and chalk waiting. Come in when you're ready, she called. We'll make sure you have something fine for that dance. Maggie looked around. The sheriff talking with ranchers by the post, women sweeping porches, the steady hum of a town starting its day. Yesterday, these same streets had felt like a trap. Now they felt like an open door. James studied her face. You don't have to stay if you don't want to, he said gently. You're free to choose. Maggie thought of Catherine, of how her story had been stolen by silence and fire. She thought of the voices that had stood up last night, and of the boy's brave little wave. She took a deep breath. I want to stay, she said, but not hidden, not as someone's problem to solve. I'll stand where people can see me. James smiled, and for once there was no shadow in his eyes. That's exactly what this town needs. Together they walked inside. Sunlight fell across the bolts of fabric, catching in the rich blue wool laid out on the counter. Ellen lifted her measuring tape with a proud grin. Let's make something that tells them you belong. As Ellen worked, Maggie felt a calm settle over her. She wasn't just a figure to gawk at or a burden to protect. She was a woman who had claimed her own place, and a community was learning to claim her, too. By the time she stepped back out into the sunlight, she felt taller in a new way, not just in inches but in spirit. Around her, the town moved with quiet purpose, and she sensed her future woven among theirs like threads and cloth. The lesson was simple, yet hard one. Fear shrinks people until they harm what they don't understand, but courage, even a small piece of it, can break that chain. Real safety comes when truth is spoken and neighbors choose to stand together. Maggie turned toward James and Ellen, her heart steady. For the first time in years, she believed the world might hold a place big enough for her strength, her voice, and her hope. And that was worth every step that had brought her here.